these two things ever be said to apply in the case of Israel? First of all, the claim that Jews hold that they have this superior status which entitles them to lord it over a non-Jewish population and so on. I mean, does one have to say anything more about this? As for the minority exercising unilateral social and political engineering and not being prepared to negotiate, well, there is an issue. But certainly, it cannot be claimed that this applies in that sense, particularly in regard to the question whether the Jews are prepared to negotiate a solution. But I leave that a little open because this is a problematic area, and if we're to discuss this seriously, we have to understand honestly the implications of our situation. Now let me move to the third question. What changed in South Africa that led to a resolution? Well, first of all, looking at what happened to the white dominant regime in South Africa, its rationale shifted from racism to what can only be described as a kind of a zero-sum game analysis of the situation and the principle of survivalism. In other words, it's either them, the blacks, who are a majority, or us. Either the one or the other will have to dominate. This was in the phase which those of you who remember or know South African history was the phase of what was called verligte or enlightened apartheid ideology. The phase in which, particularly in the 1980s, all sorts of efforts were made to turn it into what they described as separate development, to do away with the petty apartheid, to build only on the large-scale system that involved, first of all, creating a tri-cameral parliament in order to co-opt colours on the one side and the Asiatics in two separate parliaments, and then the creation of what were called Bantu homelands, or pejoratively Bantustans, which were meant to solve the problem of the black population so that they could be a proletariat, as they were, for the whites, but exercise all their political rights only in their own homelands. That was what is historically often referred to as the stage of reformed apartheid. Now, it's very important to know that apartheid underwent that change. Finally, when the apartheid regime came to the conclusion that these efforts at creating the so-called separate development, the verligte apartheid ideology, were actually untenable, and other developments in the world, particularly the collapse of the Soviet Union, because communism was always linked to the zero-sum concept that it was either the blacks who would become communists in effect against the whites, that enabled them also to modify their zero-sum game conception and the claim of survivalism as the rationale for what they were doing. When that happened, and they agreed to negotiate, the conflict came to an end. All justification for the excoriation internationally of South Africa fell away. Now I ask the question, what is it that makes it so difficult? And it is difficult. Creates so many obstacles in our attempt to counter the absolute slander that says Israel practices apartheid. Israel is an apartheid state. I think it's very important to do some deconstruction of what is going on in that attack on Israel as a so-called apartheid state. Firstly, one has to point to the amazing success of a kind of, I don't want to be too academic here, but the correct word is an ontological distortion. That is to say, a distortion semantically and of the actual substantive meaning of the concept of apartheid. What happens is something similar to, for example, what has happened to the term racism, or more familiar to us and more painful to us, to the term Holocaust. A process in which it becomes a code word for an absolute evil, and then, in other words, the epitome, in this case, of a social, societal, of a political, societal evil, as bad as Nazism was, for example, and then it's extracted from its specific historical context and transformed into a generic pejorative label, so that actually its substantive meaning is trivialized, which in effect is an absolute insult, for example, in the case of apartheid, to the struggle of the African National Congress, because it makes it out as if there were all kinds of apartheids everywhere, one of which, of course, could be Israel. And it's not that singular situation that existed there against which they struggled. And it lets the perpetrators off the hook, because it so trivializes it, it makes everything that you want to label apartheid acceptable. Any kind of ethnic conflict that you're against, you can label apartheid. This is what has happened to the term. It's become this multi-use code word. Now, together with this, at the more refined legalistic level, you know, in international law, in the 1970s already, the United Nations organs created a thing called the crime, the international crime of apartheid. And they defined it. And if you look at the terms of the definition, when they made apartheid as a concept an international crime, you will find that every clause in the description of inhuman acts that are associated with apartheid, making it a human rights crime, specifically uses the term racial. Give you an example. It says, denial to a member or members of a racial group or groups of the right to life and liberty of persons, and so on. But what our good friends, like the international lawyer that some of us know from South Africa, John Dugard, do, is they make the same kind of extension with elasticity of the term racial to include ethnic, to include, in fact, anything that they want to fit into this, and therefore they can, with great facility, embark upon an attack based upon the legalistic crime of apartheid against whatever they want to list as crimes, particular crimes committed by Israel. These, if you deconstruct what they do, this is the basis of the distortion. Now, I want to add one last point before I conclude. Yeah, thanks. And that is, how would one list the other, in addition to this kind of distortion, which I've tried to deconstruct, the other factors that stand as real obstacles in our attempt to confront this awful challenge? Well,